4 years on from the original release of The Outer Worlds, we have a new visually revamped edition of the game, the Space's Choice Edition, just for PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, S, and PC. It's a paid $10 upgrade for users on all newer machines, dangling the promise of 4K support, 60 frames per second performance, added volumetric lighting, improved effects, textures, and much more. All DLC is included as well, so on the surface, at first glance, it's a pretty good deal. In fact, let's see it in action right away. Looking at the original in comparison to the revamped Space's Choice Edition, developer Virtuous, who worked on the project, delivers a huge visual upgrade all round. This is the Xbox Series X running on both sides, the original Xbox One X code on the left and the new revamp on right, taking full advantage of the hardware. Lighting, grass, the geometry, it's all touched upon in one of the most extensive next-gen overhauls we've seen. So there's a catch. Sadly, all these visual extras do come with a trade-off. Specifically, frame rates in the Space's Choice Edition take a significant hit when compared to just playing the last-gen version on a PS5 or Series X system. So, case in point, here's the original release of The Outer Worlds running on an Xbox Series X. It's the Xbox One X code path essentially, but with soft back-compat enhancements to let it run uncapped at 60 FPS on Series X. And the same works for the PS4 edition running on a PlayStation 5. It's a lovely free extra. In the case of our Series X here, the original code also runs at a dynamic 4K resolution, and honestly, it's not a perfect 60 FPS by any means. Drops to the mid-50s and hitches are possible, but it's still locking to 60 a good bulk of the time. Now, switching over to the revamped Space's Choice Edition, still running on Series X, no doubt the visual overhaul is pretty huge. This is the 60 FPS performance mode of the new release, and as an aside, there's also a 30 FPS cinematic mode on offer, more on that later. Still though, performance mode or not, even running through this same segment, it goes well below 60 FPS in this very same spot. That's the problem in a nutshell. For $10 you get the extra eye candy, a huge amount of visual embellishments, but the cost to its frame rate is something of a devil's bargain, given PS5 and Series X users, well, they already had a way to play the game at 4K and 60 FPS. It doesn't stop at the console releases either. PC users are also reporting diminished performance, even on top-end cards, since installing the Space's Choice upgrade. Either way, the focus for today's video is squarely on the console editions, PS5, Xbox Series X, and S. How do the three differ in their visuals, and what's the frame rate like on each? Also, what are the differences between the two modes on the Space's Choice Edition, the 60 FPS performance mode and the 30 FPS cinematic mode? And of course, how far do the visual upgrades go compared to the original game? Let's find out. Let's start on the upgrades. The Space's Choice revamp on the right side runs on an updated Unreal Engine 4 build with the intent to capitalize on PS5 and Xbox Series X's horsepower by being a true native app. So this is the Series X version running on the cinematic mode on the right side, meaning it's capped at 30 FPS in order to give the best visuals possible. Right away, some of the visual changes go down as a pretty clear positive. Grass density is more abundant across the landscape of the first planet, Terra 2. It's more fleshed out, creating this flourishing opening shot. Likewise, tree assets are redrawn and texture assets are reworked. We see ground textures, rocks, broadly use higher resolution assets, and even geometry placement is altered across the scene. From the word go, it results in a more densely layered opening area. In other spots though, it's perhaps less of an objective improvement and more of an artistic sidestep. An alternative vision, if you like, to developer Obsidian's original layout. So what else? Keeping with the good news, major characters also have reworked models. Their eyes now reflect light back more realistically, and skin shaders are boosted in resolution. Note how the scars and the dirt marks across the cheeks of this character are now much more crisply defined. Not all textures are radically changed, mind you, but certainly enough to hold up to closer scrutiny. Now, developer Virtuous's other, most obvious change is the addition of volumetric lighting to the world. To be clear, the original release of The Outer Worlds already had bloom, lens flare, and a light form of the God Ray effect, but this new release allows light to fill an empty space more thoroughly. Interior areas, like this abandoned power plant, now demonstrate a density to the atmosphere. It creates a satisfying effect of lit dust, mist, and steam, and overall, it's a welcome upgrade for interior areas, from the beautiful crepuscular rays leaking through the laboratory rooftop to the streaks of light around this docking bay. It all sits very naturally. Materials and lighting are radically overhauled at points then, but it's not a universal success. At times, it's perhaps more of a subjective choice. In fact, the original version and the Spacer's Choice Edition side by side don't match perfectly in comparison, simply because the sun's position, its arc across the sky, is altered. In the end, it means shadows don't 100% line up at all times, and in fact, at points, the change gives towns a drastically different aesthetic too. The Edgewater hub, for example, takes on this deeper red hue with a lower arc to the sun. And likewise, the use of volumetric lighting has a quite drastic impact on later planets. The outskirts of the Stellar Bay hub, for example, now deploys a really heavy-handed approach to volumetrics. The rising dust, cyclones, adding a certain weight to the air, all lit by oncoming sunlight. In comparison, it's a huge artistic break from Obsidian's original game, and for returning players, it might take some adjusting to. There's a lot to take in then, both in the Spacer's Choice Edition's technical ambition and art direction, but there's also aspects that are arguably, well, downgraded. Take this opening shot for example. On the Spacer's Choice Edition on Series X, the shadow beneath the ship simply does not draw in until we get much closer, whereas the original game renders this shadow throughout the entire route forward. In any case, the Spacer's Choice Edition also affects shadow rendering more generally. See how in this pub scene, the dynamic shadows beneath the chair and from nearby characters are missing. So again, the shadows and lighting aren't always altered for the better. One more issue. Another snag is the situation with SSR, screen space reflections. Now, SSR is used in the original game, and the new revamped version has even more instances of the effect. More puddles, more reflective materials, that sort of thing. On first glance then, it's a positive move, the catch being, you must enable the game's 30fps cinematic mode to see SSR at all on the new edition. So to explain, let's switch tracks to show how the two modes work on the Spacer's Choice Edition. Whether you have PS5, Series X or S, this mode toggle operates in much the same way. Taking PS5 as an example then, the 60fps performance mode and the 30fps cinematic mode are broadly identical in textures, volumetrics, shadows, all of it. But the most obvious difference is the outright removal of SSR on the performance mode, which instead, sadly, relies on basic cube mapping to stand in for reflections. And often, these cube maps barely add any detail whatsoever, meaning it's hard to make out any reflections at all. In other words then, it's impossible to have both 60fps and SSR engaged at the same time on the Spacer's Choice Edition. It was possible originally running the 1x code on a Series X or the PS4 version on PS5, but no more with the upgraded release. Again, a huge frustration for those looking for the ultimate way to play the game, and as an aside, the only other real difference of note is that ambient occlusion runs at a lower setting on the performance mode too. Which isn't a huge loss really, the scene misses some depth, a little accuracy lost around interiors, but it's still on par with the original release's coverage. And also, if you're running on patch 1.1, which just went live midway through the making of this video, it's worth noting that PS5's performance mode drops the grass density setting as well. I'm still waiting on the Xbox Series X and S update 1.1, but it's possible Series X will follow suit in its own performance mode when the time comes. But yes, another concession to make when opting for 60fps on PS5 for now, and potentially Series X when it gets the same update. It's a very mixed turnout then. To get the best visual returns from the Spacer's Choice Edition, you'll have to run at 30 FPS, which is a clear drop coming from the 60 FPS of the older version. Also curious is the state of image quality on PS5, Series X and S. Starting with the cinematic mode, both PS5 and Series X run at a dynamic 4K, dropping to 2560 by 1440 at lowest. Fortunately, in targeting 30 FPS, these consoles do tend to have enough GPU headroom to push closer to a true 4K pixel count, but yes, drops to 1440p are possible. On balance, it's a similar setup to the last gen One X code, which had a similar range with a dynamic 4K. Fundamentally then, the promise of a 4K upgrade is something of a moot point when considering what we had before on these machines. As for Series S, well, inevitably it's a lower figure, coming in at 972p based on a bulk of tests. Oddly enough, this appears to be a typical resolution as well, with no major deviations under or over. Keeping to the cinematic mode, there's a few other visual differences worth touching on too. The drop in image quality sticks out massively on Series S of course, but it also runs with a few other unfortunate drawbacks. Grass density is lower all round in this opening area on Series S, creating a sparser, less flourishing end result. PS5 and Series X meanwhile are identical to each other in this sense, but Series S loses out. And likewise, the ambient occlusion setting is dropped for Series S. It's distractingly low in fact, and you might notice a noisy, pixelated shimmer to grassy elements on the 4 teraflop machine. The only other catch on Series S is the apparent dropping of mist and smoke effects around the opening area. Otherwise, the 3 consoles are broadly identical in textures and lighting. Switching to the performance mode on all 3 consoles doesn't change the situation. Series S continues to run with lower foliage density, worse ambient occlusion, and missing smoke effects. SSR is disabled on all 3 consoles on this 60 FPS mode too of course, and ambient occlusion lowers a setting for each console accordingly. And yes, as of patch 1.1, which was only available on PS5 as of making this video, the foliage density is dropped for the performance mode, meaning Series X in its current state on performance mode has an advantage there. Curiously though, in terms of resolution, PS5 and Series X still run at a dynamic 4K here. The key difference from the cinematic mode is that the drops below that resolution to 1440p are simply more obvious in the performance mode given the target of 60 FPS is harder to hit. So the renderer stretches to lower pixel counts to adjust. As for Series S, once again, we see it firmly sticking to a native 972p here. And once again, image quality suffers with more visual noise even while stood completely still on Series S. So performance testing up next, and the blunt truth is that neither the cinematic mode or the performance mode on any of the 3 consoles are easy to recommend. Problem number 1, well, that'll be that the 30 FPS cap on the cinematic mode has uneven frame pacing. Whether it's PS5, Series X or S, the game runs with fluctuating frame times jumping between 16, 33 and 50 milliseconds. Sometimes in fact, hitches to play occasionally add a momentary freeze to the action on all 3. The good news is that the 30 FPS cap is reasonably well held otherwise, with the exception of PS5 which I'll get to in a second. It hits that 30 FPS target most reliably on the Xbox Series consoles. It's just that the perception of motion never feels especially smooth when the frame times are so erratic, which is a shame because the 30 FPS cap on the older PS4 Pro and One X versions, if we switch back to PS4 Pro now, ran without this issue at all. Looking at PS5, Series X and even S, the frame pacing is a new problem added with the Spacer's Choice Edition, which brings us to problem number 2. There are drops under 30 FPS, especially on Sony's machine. Going back to the 3-way split, PS5 drops very slightly, just below the 30 FPS line in cinematic mode on this walk forward, while neither of the Xbox machines show this issue. And this is even with update 1.1 in place, as you can see, uniquely installed on PS5, and it gets worse in battle. Potentially drops are possible on all 3, but it's clear Sony's machine still has the bigger uphill battle sustaining 30 FPS, even updated, with these sudden spikes down to 15 FPS in battle. The pace of gameplay slows down accordingly. It's extremely jarring, and honestly enough to make aiming a struggle. Again though, even without patch 1.1 installed, for Xbox Series X and S, these drops in cinematic mode are far less of an issue all round. Except there, we're still faced with frame pacing problems. The sensible solution, in theory then, is to switch to the 60 FPS performance mode, to ditch the 30 FPS cap and just go for broke with 60 as the target. The problem? Well, it's that the performance mode is wide of the mark as well. Again, let's do our three-way test run to get a broad sense of what we're up against. In summary, PS5 shows the worst frame rate reading of the three. Now, at times, it is a match for the other two, notably on this walk forward towards the ship, but elsewhere, well, consistently it runs at a level below Series X, and even Series S, by margins of up to 8 FPS or so, where the two Xbox consoles often run in a similar range to each other, though Series X trends towards the higher results between those two. So here's a good static example. This shot has PS5 fixing to 48 FPS, while Series S and X each hover at around 54 FPS. It's a pretty clear-cut advantage then, except there's a big issue with hitching on both Xbox consoles, which just isn't as evident on PS5. It follows a similar pattern, with spikes down to 80 milliseconds and under, kicking in at just the same spots in the level on Xbox. In summary, you get a lower average frame rate on PS5 versus a higher frame rate on Xbox machines, albeit with increased levels of hitching. No matter which you pick though, any battling outdoors is apt to take you down to the 30 to 40 FPS region, and even just under 30 FPS at times on PS5. And yes, even patch 1.1 doesn't save PS5 here, not by any stretch. And while the Series X's frame rate level is better overall, still, you're looking at incredible performance spikes down to under 30 when pushed. None of this serves the player well, and even VRR supporting displays will struggle to hide it. Interior areas will, at least, generally run much better on all three machines at 60 FPS, only punctuated by heavy bursts of alpha effects, which will again drop it underneath. And focusing on Series S, it's again very hard to recommend this version in this state. Performance is all over the place in battle, running the gamut from 30 to 60 FPS just as with the other two, but again, quieter interior areas and hubs will at least get you to a tighter 60 FPS. The state of performance puts a huge damper on the Spacer's Choice Edition. Honestly, I'd much rather just go back to the original code, the Xbox One or PS4 versions running on new hardware, because they certainly feel much nicer to play than this, and there's more consistency at 60 FPS. Now, further patches have been promised to fix the game's performance issues, and I've actually left this analysis a few days since launch to try catch a few of the benefits here. As it stands right now though, even with patch 1.1 on PS5, which appears as 1.003 in the system menus, this is the experience you'll be getting for your money. The Xbox updates are due soon as well, but in fairness, Series X is already in a better place performance-wise than PS5, not counting the hitches, and in visual features as well. So I'll be looping back in the next few days to see what happens on Xbox, and if there's anything extra to report there, I'll be sure to add a note in the description. As a paid upgrade, the Spacer's Choice Edition is best avoided for now. The visual tweaks are broadly speaking well done, but might prove divisive when compared to the original game's art direction. The more obvious trouble though is the technical stuff, the performance stuff, the uneven 30 FPS frame pacing on the cinematic mode, and the 30 to 60 FPS range of the performance mode on PS5, Series X and S. Certainly going by the results on PS5 today, updates past 1.1 still have a lot to fix to justify the upgrade fee, and for those that have already bought in, I seriously hope it's possible to turn this release around soon. But that's all from me today. If you did find this analysis useful or insightful in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.